As we observe Philippine Environment Month this June and World Environment Day today, the Environment Department is enjoining each of us to do our part in taking care of the planet. Now, I got to speak with Environment Secretary Toni Yulo-Loyzaga, and she told me how the DENR is addressing the main threats of the environment, like climate change and plastic pollution, and how it's dealing with the threat of low water supply.
The biggest threat, as we know, is climate change. And when we say climate change, we don't just mean rapid onset climate disasters. We look at slow onset climate disasters and how that's changing the way rainfall is happening in the country, where it falls, and how much of it falls. That's one of the slow onset concerns that we have. The other one would be how temperature is changing and how that impacts our environment, specifically the urban environment as well. We all talk about the heat index and what's happening whenever we reach temperatures of a certain level. What that does to our health, what it does to air quality, what it does to, again, the possibility of a water shortage in terms of supply for our cities and our communities. All of that needs to be taken into consideration. So climate change has a far-reaching impact on our environment, ecosystems, communities, and sectors, businesses as well.
Right.
I think second here would be the way we are practicing production and consumption, and that really has to do with the way we manage the waste from these activities. And here we have a constant reminder about the impacts of plastics on our environment, both marine and land-based, and what that does to our food supply, to our water supply, and of course to the ecosystems that we need to be supported in order for us to ensure that we actually are able to support the populations that are growing. Solid waste management as a whole is a great challenge for our country. We do have laws that are in place. We do have ways to ensure that each of the local governments have their local solid waste management plans. Enforcement is key. Implementation of the environmental conditions under which we manage our solid waste are really important. And that requires technical capacity, it requires resources, and plastics are one of the major sources of our solid waste problem. How we rely on plastics to package, for example, are one of the issues that we are beginning to tackle with the Extended Producer's Responsibility Law that we are implementing at the moment. And here's where we shift the responsibility away solely to look from local governments and national government to the different stakeholders and the private sector contributors specifically.
Right. How compliant are the companies in doing their part as far as the EPR Act of 2022 goes?
Well, it's an uphill battle, I would say, but there are a number of responsible corporations. They are the large ones and some of the small ones as well, I should say. The registration of the corporations and these different obliged enterprises is the challenge. So what we're doing is we're launching a very concerted campaign. We're going to be working with the industrial parks, with the PEZAs, for example, with the local governments to actually harness the different stakeholders they have in each of the local governments to register and actually comply with the Extended Producer's Responsibility Law. Our registration is still quite low relative to the number of enterprises, which are in several thousands. We still only have about 400 to 500 registrants, so there's a long ways to go. But we do need a strategy that is multidimensional, and that's how we're engaging the different stakeholders to actually comply.
Right, but we have to start somewhere, I suppose. How crucial is the EPR in the country's transition to the circular economy? And the circular economy is one of those buzzwords that get thrown around a lot, but let's unpack that a little bit. What exactly are we talking about, and how would we illustrate the idea or the concept of a circular economy?
But the whole idea is for resources to actually not find their way into situations where they're just left to the wayside and basically decompose. And actually, for those that cannot decompose, impact the natural environment so that impacts our societies as well. So here we are in a situation where we do need to profile our solid waste. The EPR law specifically also looks into plastic packaging, as you know, and to see how we might be able to reuse, recycle, upcycle in fact, these materials in order to create value so that they're not just left to be disposed of, and of course then impact the long-term ecosystem integrity. There is a social dimension to solid waste management. And we do know that single-use plastic is a material that is used, of course, predominantly, of course, possibly in the public markets, in the wet markets, because there is no other recourse. There is no other material that can serve the same purpose. And here's where there is a responsibility on the part of government and on the part of private corporations to invest in the kind of research that is needed. This is about chemistry. This is about investment in processes that will actually produce materials that can degrade properly.
Water, it's the most basic of human needs. Last March, I understand that you attended the United Nations 2023 Water Conference in New York. What is the situation now when it comes to water supply globally and here in the country? It seems that we have water where we don't want it and when we don't want it, and a problem of scarcity whenever we are in need of water. How do we solve a crisis like this?
Well, one of the predominant themes, I think, being discussed at that particular conference was how water, biodiversity, climate, and human development are inextricably linked. So sanitation and the access to potable water are very critical, not just to public health, but to the integrity of our ecosystems. We do need water to flow through in such a state that, in fact, it will support life.
Right.
And so here we are at this point in the country where we have different cities that are highly urbanized, that are beginning to feel the water stress. Much of this really has to do with the use of groundwater sources rather than untapping the available surface water sources in order for us to supply the needs of our communities. There are three essential areas where we can intervene on the supply side, and that really has to do with identifying surface water that can actually serve our communities. That, of course, is dependent on climate, and here's where the intersection really happens. The next area where we can intervene is in the infrastructure that we use in order to tap into the sources and distribute to our communities. The third area is at the demand side. How do we manage our demand? Are we in fact conserving, or are we in fact wasting this precious resource? So these three areas are very critical. In terms of our own urbanizing country, we do need to understand that at times, the water sources that these cities will rely on really also are situated beyond their political and administrative boundaries. The spring sources come from the mountains. They are not in the urban areas. And so it is important for us to manage an integrated approach to water resource conservation as well as use. And that means that we are all dependent on one another. The local governments need to understand that we need to share these resources responsibly and not hoard them or prevent other local governments from having access to potable water.
How do we find that critical balance between tourism, which is a source of livelihood for the people who live there, as is the environment itself, providing for their needs in a very literal sense, from the fish and seafood that is gathered there for the people that live there. How do we find that balance between tourism, the needs of the people who actually live in that area, and also the bigger picture of sustainability?
Well, I think what's really important is to realize that ecotourism and tourism in general really is completely reliant on an environment that actually will support the kind of experience that people are needing when they come to these areas. And so we have an extreme case, as you know, Paolo, in the case of Boracay and how it was shut down because, in fact, of the excesses and the failure to comply with several environmental laws. And that actually is not an isolated case. In the previous administration, 5 sites were identified as high-value ecotourism areas that needed environmental intervention. And those 5 sites were Boracay, Siargao, Panglao, El Nido, and Puerto Galera, which is in Oriental Mindoro. These 5 sites are among the highest value ecotourism sites in the country. And yet we have situations wherein competing uses and, unfortunately, the failure to actually comply with environmental laws and regulations actually have caused the degradation of these environments. People need to realize that if the immediate impact of the failure to comply with environmental laws is not felt by certain sectors, that circle will be closed very soon. In fact, water sources in these areas are among the most contaminated. And so what we are wanting to do is in fact establish standards and thresholds. I'd like to say that we work very closely with the DOT, the strategic roadmap for ecotourism in this country, and we work with the DILG to engage the local governments in establishing thresholds for certain activities so that in fact they can sustain the kind of quality environmentally that will actually support fishing, that will actually support tourism-related livelihoods, sustainable agriculture, as well as water security for these areas.
Are there any other DENR projects that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, I'd like to talk about a project we're calling Transform. And that really is a project that applies what we call transdisciplinary approaches to our managing the environment. And what that entails is actually a group of different stakeholders, the DNR included. And I'll cite one particular situation, for example, where Transform is working in the province of Bataan. What Transform does is it tries to find solutions and directions that are based on the evidence that comes from a climate and disaster risk assessment of an LGU. And we look at the different dimensions of the exposure and vulnerability and design solutions specifically for that. In the case of Bataan, there's a very keen awareness of how climate vulnerable they are in terms of flooding, especially. And there's a very keen awareness of how that's linked to the general well-being and the HDI of the province. And so what we're doing there is we're combining greenhouse gas accounting, biodiversity inventories, the implementation of the EPR law, health service delivery systems, and sustainable livelihoods and enterprises by engaging different partners, the National Resilience Council, the Zwillig Family Foundation, EDC, for example, and different corporations there as part of an integrated approach towards making Bataan, I would say, the #1 province in terms of the Human Development Index in the country. And all of that is working together with the DNR and the DOST and academia as well. So it's a concerted effort that we're trying to put together for different LGUs. Siargao is going to be next. We're now working in Ormoc City as well. So Transform will be something that we'll try to replicate in the different provinces.
I'm really so blown away by just how much you guys have on your plate, but how much work you guys are also doing to, like I said, put things in their right place. And rather than leave it all up to you, I think we should enjoin everyone to realize that we all have a role to play here. And it's certainly not just the DENR, but we thank you for all the work that you guys are doing. And, you know, it inspires us to become a little more involved. It's been a fantastic chat. We've covered so much and we've taken a lot of your time. I want to say thank you so much to Environment Secretary Toni Yulo-Loyzaga. Ma'am, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paolo. We need your help and we look forward to working together with you in the future.